Good afternoon, everyone. I am really honored to be here to kick off this wonderful event organized by Joanna Pizzulo and the great folks at Meworth Center. A round of applause for what is really an excellent and really important community event, and I hope there'll be more coming. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about it in the future. So I am here this afternoon to talk to you about solitude. Let me start off by giving you, I guess, a little signpost about where we're going to be headed in our chat this afternoon. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about, what is solitude, what it is, what it isn't. It turns out that it's actually a little bit more complicated to define and to measure than you might think upon first reflection. So we'll dive into that for a little bit at the beginning of our time together. And then I'm going to talk to you about the duality of solitude, how it can be two sides of this big coin and can represent both good and bad things, sometimes even at the same time. And in the last part of our chat, we'll get to sort of like the practical stuff, right? We're going to try to do some knowledge translation, as they call it here at the university, where we're going to take some of the results of some of the recent research into aspects of solitude, and we'll try to turn them into practical advice, a user guide, so to speak, that gives us some ideas about how we can all best take advantage of the promises that solitude makes in terms of some of its benefits. So when I say the word solitude, I think a lot of people might think of an image like this, right? Here is a famous photo by Jean Guichard. This is the lighthouse keeper alone, facing the elements, right? There's maybe an element of danger in here, some romantic aspects, and tinged with some melancholy and sadness. It gives us this idea of what is clearly someone in solitude. Of course, here in Ottawa, maybe we might be more likely to think about a morning skate on the canal. Hopefully this year we actually get to do that. Stupid global warming. And of course, over the last several years, all around the world, experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns and social distancing really served to shine a really bright spotlight on how important it is to consider experiences of solitude, as millions of people around the world were thrust into unwanted solitude. So when we talk about solitude, again, this is something we all know about. Everybody spends time alone. We all experience solitude across the human lifespan. Solitude actually gradually increases from around 15% of waking hours in childhood. Of course, there's safety issues. We're not going to leave an infant or a very young child alone for any extended period of time. Up to around 30% of time in adults, and to over 50% of the time among older adults. So clearly this is something that we all do, that we all experience. And when I got into this area, it always surprised me that there wasn't more research looking at the implications of spending time alone, given how much it was just a normative and everyday activity. Now, as I mentioned before, solitude is actually somewhat complicated. Try to think about how you would define solitude to someone who doesn't speak the language, who comes from another planet, doesn't understand what kind of words pop into your mouth. How would you try to characterize what it means to be in solitude, what it means to be alone? Well, a common historical definition is to talk about solitude as a physical separation from others. Okay? So this works quite well and quite objectively at extreme values. Okay? So it's pretty clear that this person sitting alone on a deserted island is in solitude. And that seems pretty straightforward. But when we start to get into it in a little bit more detail, it turns out that it gets a little more fuzzy. Okay? So there is not actually an agreed upon criterion to tell us how far apart you have to be from other people, how physically separated is enough to be considered in solitude. Right? Is it far enough away that you can't see people anymore? Is it far enough away that you can't hear them? Right? Is a teenager who's alone in their room with their door closed but their family's still at home, is that solitude? Okay? So it starts to get fuzzy as we start moving to these less extreme values, and that's just when we're considering people. If I'm taking a 2-hour walk in the forest with my pet dog, is that solitude? What if it's a cat? What about my goldfish? What if I bring my pet rock? Right? So you can see even just trying to make something concrete and objective in terms of what constitutes solitude turns out to be much more complicated. Okay? Now, a philosopher and sociologist by the name of Goffman in the 1960s used the metaphor of the stage and the spotlight as a way of trying to deal with these issues. Okay? So the idea here is that when we are with other people, when we're interacting socially, it's like we're on a stage. We have an audience, and some of those audience members are critics. Okay? And so the idea here is that when we are performing on stage, when we are under the spotlight, there are restrictions, limitations to how we behave, right? We are constricted in terms of the feelings that we might be able to show, the words that we might want to say, the behaviors that we might want to demonstrate. Okay? And so being around other people not only comes with these kinds of imposed restrictions, but also for some people, the very real concern, what is this person thinking about me? How are they evaluating what I'm doing? How are my behaviors and things that I'm saying being interpreted? These kinds of social evaluative concerns can be extremely stressful. Okay? So, using this metaphor of the stage and the spotlight, solitude is stepping off the stage. It's stepping out of the spotlight. And it's a freedom from these kinds of constraints. It's a freedom from these kinds of external pressures on how we're supposed to behave and feel. It's the chance to be your authentic self, your true self. You have some privacy. You have the chance to behave and do things that you can control, that you can be the master of your domain, so to speak. And that already tells us something that's really important in terms of a benefit of solitude. It's a respite from the kinds of pressures that we have from being around other people. Okay? So these kinds of ideas situate solitude not so much as a physical place, not as a state of being, but a little bit more as a state of mind. Okay? So now we're talking about more contemporary understanding of solitude, which thinks about more of a perceived separation from others. Okay? So now we're talking about being alone in a crowd. Okay? And I know it's a very common experience. People go into a coffee shop, they sit down, maybe they put their headphones on, like this little gentleman here in the corner of my little graphic, and they work. And there's other people around, but as it's illustrated in the picture, they kind of fade to the background. So they're there, but you really are in your own space, and you feel like you're separated from others. Right? For some, it's walking alone in the streets of a city in a foreign country where there's no chance that you're going to run into someone who knows you. That's the freedom that solitude can afford for us. Okay? However, contemporary understanding of solitude is, of course, influenced by modern technology. And now with modern technology, it is absolutely common to be physically separated with others, right? Physically separated from others, but virtually engaged, sometimes literally face-to-face in social interactions with others, right? So technology really has forced us to re-examine what it means to be alone and consider the implications of solitude when technology is involved. And it's a kind of an existential crisis for the existence of solitude in a lot of ways. Because can you ever really be alone and in solitude if you're walking around all the time with a device in your pocket that at any moment can suddenly thrust you back into the spotlight? Okay, so we'll talk a little about the implications of that for solitude later on, but it really has forced us to kind of re-examine from a modern lens some of our, older, antiquated versions of solitude. We really need to, bring it up to speed in terms of what modern technology allows us to do. Now, one of the things that I love about solitude that has always attracted me to this as a topic for study, that has fascinated me, is that aside from just being complicated, solitude is actually, it's paradoxical, right? It simultaneously can represent and make you feel two almost opposite things. So let's give me an example, okay? Solitude is often a reward. For parents out there, you work a long day, you come home, then you got to deal with the kids, you finally get them off the bed, you read them the 12th story, which is the same book 12 times, and then you finally get them to sleep, and you step out of the bedroom and you go, right? And you cannot wait to gift yourself, to reward yourself with some me time, right? With some alone time. That's your present for a job well done. That's how you motivate yourself to get through a long and stressful day. At the end of it, you get a little time for yourself. But at the same time, solitude is often a punishment. Right? A timeout for a misbehaving toddler, or solitary confinement for the worst of our incarcerated criminals. Right? So here's the exact same circumstance, the exact same behavior, being by yourself, that can be both a reward and a punishment. Okay? As I mentioned right at the outset, solitude is something that we all do. It's normative. If you're walking down the street and you see someone sitting alone on a park bench, you don't think twice about it. Okay, so it's clearly a part of our human experience, but at the same time, solitude is also seen as a cause, a consequence, and a symptom of some serious mental health problems, right? Major depressive disorder, social anxiety disorder, avoidant personality disorder, all of these very significant and disruptive mental health challenges all are affiliated either from a causal or from a symptom point with spending too much time alone. And again, the same behavior, okay under these kinds of circumstances, not so okay over here. Okay? As we're going to find out today, solitude can be good for you. And I think that's something that a lot of people generally understand. So something can be good for us. But if we're honest, most people don't like it very much. Okay? There's a great study that was done with US college students a few years ago where they asked the participants to go into a room and just be alone with their thoughts. Okay? 15 minutes. It's not even a very long time. 15 minutes sitting alone on a chair in a room, no tech, okay? No anything, just sit there and think. Okay? And then they, of course, asked them how it went. They gave them some psychological tests before and after. Needless to say, that, overall, this group of students, they hated being by themselves. They found it unpleasant. They found it boring. Okay? But the part that always gets me is the majority of the participants found it so aversive, so unpleasant, that they would rather self-administer a painful electric shock than spend 15 minutes sitting alone in their room. Okay? Really? So I think it's pretty clear to say that a lot of people don't like solitude. I mean, that's okay. We don't like spinach, maybe. It's still good for us, right? So we'll come back to that a little bit later. But all of these, paradoxical issues really can be subsumed under the broader theme. Solitude can be both good or bad. Okay? So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the bad, and then we're going to transition for the rest of the talk into sort of the good. But we can't ignore the bad, right? Because you can't just give a one-sided description of solitude, because for too long it has gotten the one-sided description, only the bad. So we have to acknowledge that, and then we can kind of move on towards the good. Okay? So the idea that solitude is bad goes back a really long time. Here's the oldest reference you'll see in a talk, I think, from the book of Genesis. And the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone." Okay? Now psychologists have written about the difficulties and done research about the potential problems and negative aspects of solitude for a long time. Okay? I'm a developmental psychologist by training. Developmental psychologists have a problem with solitude because what they equivalent solitude to is not spending time with your friends. Okay? So the peer group, children's friends, is an important and really unique context for young children, older children, and adolescents to develop, implement, and exploit a whole bunch of really important skills. We learn a lot of good stuff from our friends, right? We learn social skills, how to negotiate, how to cooperate, how to solve social problems, conflict resolution. It's good for our language development. It helps us communicate. It's good for our cognitive development. It helps us understand other people's perspectives, right? You go into a group of kids, everybody's got a different idea. It challenges young children's idea that everybody thinks exactly like them. Amazing stuff. Intimacy, support, all the good stuff we get from our friends. This is really important. Okay? So you can understand why developmental psychologists would be concerned if you're spending too much time alone as a kid, then you're missing out on these opportunities, and over time you might come to fall behind on the acquisition and practice and implementation of these critical skills, and that's a problem. Okay? So again, there is a reason to be concerned here. Right? Social psychologists have done a lot of work to demonstrate that being around others is really good for our mood. Okay? Like being around others actually makes us happier. It's a great study that was done in Chicago a few years ago. A bunch of researchers went to commuter train stations, okay, and they recruited people who were about to get on an hour-long train ride to go to work. Okay? And before they got on the train, they interviewed them and they gave them some psychological tests. They asked them a whole bunch of questions. They measured their mood, their personality, and they randomly told half of them to sit by themselves, and the other half were given instructions to initiate a conversation with someone on the train. Okay? Then off they went on the train. They came back at the platform when they got off. They gave them a whole series of tests again. Results were a little bit complicated, but the most straightforward result was overall, everybody who spoke to someone else felt happier. Okay? And this didn't matter whether or not you tended to be introverted or a little bit shy. If you predicted it was going to be stressful to talk to someone else, it didn't matter. No matter how you felt about it, no matter what your personality was, overall, being around other people makes us happier. And there's lots of subsequent research to suggest that, generally speaking, experiences with other people around are thought to be more positive, to have more positive emotions than experiences when they're alone. Okay? Now, part of this we think has to do with evolution. Right? Evolutionary biologists talk about the advantages historically of groups for the human species survival. Okay? So it was adaptive for humans as a species to congregate, to be in groups for a whole bunch of important reasons. Protections from predators, sharing of resources, division of labor, access to food, availability of mates. Right? People who stuck together had a better chance of literally of surviving. Okay? And so it is good for us to be around other people. Okay? And that has led to what's called the need to belong, a basic human need we think has evolved with us because of those experiences, right? That generally speaking, we feel inside at birth and onwards a general need to be around other people. Okay? So you can again imagine if we're spending too much time in solitude, then we might thwart that need. Those needs might be left unsatisfied. And that leads to an important question. What happens if the need to belong is not met? So what happens if we are not perceiving that we are interacting enough with others, that we're not satisfied, we're unhappy with our social relationships? Well, that leads to loneliness. Okay? Loneliness sucks. Loneliness is a really bad thing. There's no good side about it. Okay? These are bad feelings that come from perceiving that our social lives are not satisfactory. Okay? It's a discrepancy between how we would like to have our social life, the number of friends we have, the intimacy that we have with our friends and acquaintances and family, the time that we get to spend together with them. If any of those things are not up to our own personal level of what we would want, we feel lonely. So it's important to understand that it's a discrepancy, right? So you personally are feeling unsatisfied with this aspect of your social life. And for people who are chronically lonely, it has profound negative effects. Loneliness gets a lot of press for good reason. Okay? So loneliness has a significant negative impact on our well-being, our mental health, and even our physical health. Okay? And you may have this idea that it's kind of getting worse. Certainly there have been statistics to suggest that levels of chronic loneliness and social isolation have been going up over time. 2023, the US Surgeon General's office released this advisory, a report. They called it the epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And among many interesting things that they revealed is that it's as bad for us to have chronic social isolation and loneliness as it is to smoke 15 cigarettes a day. It actually raises your risk for mortality to the same degree. Okay? So again, we cannot dismiss the importance of loneliness, the importance of social connection. We evolved to be that way. We cannot ignore these basic needs. Okay? So I would never want anyone to misinterpret anything that I'm saying about the positive aspects of solitude to be somehow diminishing the importance of human connection, to be somehow diminishing that loneliness is an epidemically horrible thing that we need to continue to stamp out. And we are paying attention, right? It deserves our attention. Right? A few years ago, the UK appointed a minister of loneliness. Okay? This is fantastic in terms of raising awareness among these sorts of issues. Other countries are following suit. Canada's even thinking about it itself. Okay? So we really should be paying attention to loneliness, and that's one really important initial message, I think, that we all will have to acknowledge before we move on to the rest, right? Which is that loneliness is a chronic problem, and it can be absolutely detrimental to our mental and physical health. Okay? But a major point, of course, is loneliness is not solitude. So now we're going to switch gears. Okay? So loneliness are these feelings that we get, this dissatisfaction with maybe we feel like we're spending too much time alone. Maybe we feel like we're not satisfied with the quality and the intimacy of our close relationships. We're not getting enough time to hang out with other people. Okay? So these negative feelings have really negative implications. But although they're linked to solitude, it's not a one-to-one correspondence. For example, you can feel lonely when you're around other people. Okay? Teenagers often tell us that they feel lonely sitting at the family dinner table. Okay? You go to a work meeting or you go to a work social event afterwards and you're milling around and there's a bunch of people making small talk and you don't feel connected to everyone. You could be surrounded by people that you could be free to have conversations with and feeling lonely. Okay? So you don't actually have to be by yourself to feel lonely. And of course, you can be alone and not feel lonely. Right? So solitude is a place. Solitude is a context, and particularly when we have some choice and some control over that solitude, as we're going to see, it's a very different thing than loneliness, and that's really the first sort of major point I want to make sure that people understand as we move forward. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this good stuff that solitude is supposed to do for us. Okay? So there's actually a long history of poets, philosophers, psychologists, and others writing impassioned pleas, essays of solitude is good, and here's all the reasons why. Okay? And when I first got into this field many years ago, I was so excited to read these books. I was so amped about, I guess, now let's get into the detailed psychological literature. Let's find all the empirical studies that support these ideas. Not so much. Right? So despite having all of these pleas, despite having all of these passionate essays talking about, and then they all started citing each other and nobody actually cited any studies. And so it was a little bit of telephone tag, right? Broken telephone, where everybody sort of assumed there was all this literature that was supporting it. And when you actually got down into the weeds to look at it, there wasn't actually a lot of empirical research that directly provided evidence for this. Now, I believed it to be true and still do. And I'm glad to report to you that over the last few years, we have actually found some research that allows us to tell that this is actually the case. Okay? So the kinds of benefits that we're talking about, self-reflection, creativity, solitude is a place for the imagination. Solitude is a place for you to restore, recharge your battery is a term you often heard from people, that they need some me time so that they can recharge themselves and face whatever comes next. It's a place for spiritual exploration and religious experiences. It's a place to relax. And it's also a place to just kind of do fun stuff. Right? I don't think we talk about that enough. Solitude is a place where you can choose what you want to do, and you can choose leisure, where you want to go for a walk, you want to knit, right? You want to watch a YouTube video, whatever. You get to choose what you want to do, and as we'll see, that is actually a critical component of getting some of those benefits. Okay, so major point number one about why solitude is so complicated is because all solitude is not created equal. Okay, there's lots of different reasons why we spend time alone. And those different reasons why we spend time alone are directly linked to the kinds of experiences we have in solitude and to the implications of those experiences for our well-being. So, I have to give you a little crash course on motivation theory here, okay? Because motivations for choosing solitude matter. So let's try to understand a little bit about some basic motivation theory. So there's two main kinds of motivations. Some motivations are called extrinsic motivation. And that's when you're doing something usually for an outside reason. Usually the source that is motivating you is on the outside. So you might be seeking something to, to get a reward. So if you hate your job, you might do it because you need the money. Okay? You might do it to avoid punishment. You might do it because you have fear of failure, so you have to keep going. When I was a young kid, my parents forced me, I use that word intentionally, to take piano lessons, because that's what we did in our family. Everybody took piano lessons. So for years, starting from a very young age, I had to practice every day, I had to play my scales. I hated it. I complained. I would watch the clock down to the last second when I could stop doing it. And when I was 13 years old, they said, now that you're a teenager, if you want to stop, you can stop. And I stopped. Okay? That's because my motivations for playing piano at that time were only extrinsic. Okay? So hold that thought. Then you have these things called intrinsic motivations. Those are the ones that come from the inside. That's when you're doing something because it's for you. You're interested in it. It has meaning for you. You enjoy it. You're curious about it. And suddenly when you're doing things for intrinsic motivations, you don't need those other rewards. You don't need to pay you. Thank goodness academics have intrinsic motivation to do their work, because we work a lot of hours. We would never make anybody else work as hard as we make ourselves work. We do it because we're passionate about what we do, because it's meaningful for us, because it is something that we are curious about. Okay? So there's more to the story about my piano playing. When I was 13 and stopped my lessons, I started listening to the radio, and I started hearing pieces like, oh, I would like to play that on the piano. So I would sit down and try to figure it out and start to play it. My fingers wouldn't move. I couldn't really do it properly, and it clicked. That's why I had to play all those scales, right? That's why I had to do all that practicing. And in a very short period of time, it went from my parents saying you have to practice for X amount of minutes, from my parents saying, shut up, we want to go to sleep, stop playing piano. Because the difference was now it was for me, right? I was intrinsically motivated to do these activities. So how does that apply to solitude, right? What are some of the extrinsic motivations? What are some of the outside reasons why we might spend time in solitude? Well, one that we've already sort of mentioned is social isolation. That's when you are forced into unwanted solitude, right? So for kids, it might be because they're rejected, excluded, or victimized, right? They are spending more time by themselves because nobody wants to play with them. Right? For adults, it might be you move to a new city, you don't have a wide social network, or I don't know, you experience a global pandemic and you're in lockdown for months at a time, and right, you're not allowed out on the street. So when solitude is forced upon you and you don't have a choice in the matter, you can see how that could be the most extrinsic in terms of negative reasons why we could spend time alone. But it's not always external things. Okay? Some people choose solitude not because they like it or they want to go there, but it's an escape. It's a way to avoid something else. It's a way of avoiding a punishment. Okay, so for some people, social experiences are unpleasant or stressful, or they make them feel self-conscious, or they worry and ruminate about how people are treating them or what they're thinking about them. And so although they might be interested in going and interacting with others, it's so stressful for them, it makes them feel so self-conscious and anxious that they end up giving up and they go spend time by themselves. And there the solitude it's kind of like a incidental result of avoiding other people. Right? And people who spend time in solitude for these reasons usually spend that time worrying and ruminating and being unhappy. Okay? So again, these extrinsic motivations for solitude most likely to lead to negative outcomes, like we've talked about, right? Depression, loneliness, all this bad stuff. What about intrinsic motivations for solitude? That's now we've got to flip the coin to the other side, right? What if solitude is meaningful for you? What if you're choosing to do it? What if it's something that you think is going to be beneficial to you, that you're curious about, that you're enjoying? Now you're not avoiding other places, you're not being forced into it, but you're choosing to spend that time alone. That's when we see the good stuff, right? That's when we talk about those benefits of solitude, and that's what we have to now sort of focus in on. Why would we all want to choose those kinds of things? Okay, so I've mentioned very quickly some of these benefits, right? Self-reflection, self-exploration, right? Solitude is when you learn about yourself, place for restoration, creativity, all those kinds of things. So a basic question that we should all be asking ourselves is, why don't more people take advantage of this, right? Solitude has a bad reputation for sure, right? And again, it's well earned. There's a reason why we should be concerned about people that are spending time alone for these kinds of reasons. But these benefits are also pretty well established now. People know that solitude can be good, but for some reason, which we're going to tackle, right? People don't take advantage of it, and they have a lot of I don't know, complaints, or I would say, misunderstandings about solitude that prevent them as a barrier for them engaging in solitary activities. And so we're going to, put together a little user guide that's going to be structured to address the main complaints that prevent people from spending time in solitude. So we'll just go through one at a time. Okay? So what's the number one complaint about solitude? I hate to be alone. I'd rather give myself an electric shock. That's how bad, right? That's a pretty serious complaint, right? People are not messing around. If they would rather self-shock than spend 15 minutes sitting alone in a room, then clearly, this is something we need to try to address. Okay? This one actually turns out to be pretty simple. Okay? Literally, fake it till you make it. Okay? There's a series of studies that suggest, there were some researchers in the UK, they tried to replicate this sit 15 minutes alone with your thoughts experiment. And they gave half of the participants a very simple instruction. While you're there, just think positive thoughts about solitude. That's it. And those people ended up feeling better after they came out. Okay? So it could really be as simple, at least to get started, as just change your mindset a little little mind over matter, right? It's okay for me to be by myself. This could be a good thing. Open yourself up to the opportunity that solitude might represent. Okay? And one of the things that you might benefit from this is solitude has this ability to take the edge off of our negative emotions. So remember, I said to you before, time with others can be more positive and time alone might be more negative, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? Because aside from just positive and negative emotions, our emotions also differ in terms of their intensity, right? Their arousal level. So you can have a high intensity negative emotion like anger, or you could have a low intensity negative emotion, right? Like being sad, okay? But it turns out solitude is really good for taking the edge off of these high intensity emotions, particularly negative ones. So if you're feeling really angry or agitated, even 15 minutes alone, right, takes the edge off. That's one of the reasons why timeouts work, right? Is because toddlers are often really upset when we put them in a timeout, and it just gives them a chance to catch their breath, and just that lack of stimulation from everywhere else, it's a little reset, and it takes the edge off. It calms people down. Okay? And there's research to suggest that calming effect of solitude, it's not just short term. There's been studies showing that it lasts 15 minutes a day. A week later, you're still experiencing some of the calming effects that you get from solitude. So it's a very powerful effect. And there's a lot of potential here that I don't think people are using. Okay? What's another common complaint? I'm too busy. I don't have time to take a 2-hour walk in the woods. Okay? Well, here's the thing. You don't really have to. Okay? So it's like anything else. Solitude's like a muscle, okay? So if you haven't used it a lot before, you've got to exercise it slowly, okay? And not everybody's going to want to take a 2-hour walk in the woods. I would. That to me sounds like bliss. A 2-hour walk in the woods sounds wonderful. But not everybody has the inclination or the time specifically to take a 2-hour walk in the woods. And that's okay because, as we're going to see, solitude is a personal experience, and you should be able to personalize it yourself, as we're going to see going forward, okay? So you don't have to start off with a 2-hour walk in the woods. What we recommend are these little micro moments of solitude, right? Thread them during the day. As I said before, there's evidence to suggest that even 15 minutes a day of solitude can have longer term impacts on your emotions, calm you down. You can start to reap some of these benefits, okay? Now, if you start doing it, you're thinking these positive thoughts, remember, because you're there and you don't want it to, sort of jinx yourself by thinking how terrible this is. You can do it for 15 minutes a day. That's not terrible. You might find that you'd like a little bit more and you're enjoying it, so then you stretch it out a little bit more. You build up those solitude muscles, right? But as we'll see later, everybody's going to have their own just right amount. That's the perfect amount of them to spend each day. Okay, and then other people are like, I know meditation's good, but that's not for me. I'm just not into it. I find it boring. It doesn't work for me. I can't calm my thoughts. Okay? By the way, meditation is awesome, and I highly recommend meditation, but I also understand, that it's proven clinically to have wonderful boosting effects on our well-being. It can help deal with stresses, but not for everybody, which I understand. Okay? But here's the thing. I think that's misunderstood that solitude has to be meditation. You don't have to sit by yourself for 15 minutes just with your thoughts. Okay? Right? You do you. You spend solitude your way. And there is now good research coming out that suggests that as long as we choose a meaningful, right, intrinsically motivated activity, something that is personal to us, that is meaning for us, that we're engaged in, that we enjoy, if you do that when you're in solitude, that opens you up to those kinds of benefits. Okay? So read a book, right? Go for a walk, sure. Listen to music, knit, watch your favorite show on Netflix. Okay? You don't have to be strict in terms of what you do in solitude. It's the context and the choice that's most important. Okay? And make sure that it's a personal and private experience that you do for yourself. Right? We shouldn't have to ask for that me time. Right? It's okay, as we'll see later, to take some of that time for yourself. Okay, but a little bit of advice. Okay, maybe turn off your phone. Now I understand, if you're reading a book on your phone, maybe you have your phone open when you're doing that. That's fine. Or if you're reading news or something like that, I mean, turn off at least your notifications, right? You need a little, disconnecting from your phone for 15 minutes, that's good advice, period, regardless of whether you're spending time in solitude or not. But there is now research increasingly demonstrating that just that possibility of being contacted by an alert or by someone, right? It kind of interferes with some of these benefits that we're talking about. And if solitude is supposed to be restorative, it's supposed to be a chance for you to let your mind wander a little bit and not be drawn into the outside world, not have that spotlight on you, then at least turning off your notifications if you can't turn off your phone. I recommend just putting your phone away if you can. Okay? But I understand that's not always feasible. At least disconnect a little bit while you are putting yourself in solitude, and then just choose something that you want to do that you enjoy. It's okay to enjoy solitude. Right? It doesn't have to be a chore. It doesn't have to be a task. Right? It doesn't have to be spinach. Right? It can be something. Some of you are like, I like spinach. Right? So it can be something that you enjoy, and it's okay for you to enjoy it. It's still going to be good for you. And then you hear people say, well, yeah, solitude's all fine and good. I'm a people person. I am happy when I'm around others, right? All the extroverts out there, the sociable people out there, right? They're like, yeah, that's all fine and good, but that's not for me. I am a people person. Okay? Well, that's true, but you don't have to just do that. And there is recent evidence over the last few years that it turns out that it's really that balance that is the most important. Okay? So we can all benefit from time with others, and we can all benefit from time by ourselves. And all of you extroverts out there could probably benefit from a little bit more time by yourself. Right? And all of you introverts out there could probably benefit from a little bit more time with others, even if you forecast that it's going to be stressful or tiring or exhausting, or if you're feeling a little bit socially anxious, as we saw from the train experiment, it's still going to make you feel better. And I would make the same claim about solitude. If you're a raging extrovert and you find solitude so aversive, you're like, yeah, I would have done those shocks. That's me. I'm just like, let me have it, as many as you take. Give yourself the chance, build up that muscle a little bit, and you will still find that there are some positives there. Okay? So how do we find that balance? Right? Really simple thing to do, just keep a diary for a week, 2 weeks. Keep track of your solitary time, your time spent alone, your time spent with others, and just on the simplest scale you can think of, sad face, straight line face, smiley face, how you were feeling. Track your mood, track your social and solitary time, and look for patterns. And that will give you an idea about, I didn't realize when I spent this time alone afterwards, I actually was feeling pretty good. Okay? And there's a lot to be said about the going back and forth. There's a lot of benefits about this balance between solitude and others. And here's where the research starts to come in. Okay? Great study, some researchers in Europe. Okay? They studied brainstorming. Okay? So you can imagine in the organizational psychology world, there's a lot of pressure to come up with the best way to come up with creative ideas, with new ideas. So there were a bunch of researchers who studied different kinds of brainstorming sessions and how they work. And this one group was really interested in the difference between solitary brainstorming, right? Go off by yourself and write down all these ideas that you came up with. Group brainstorming, where everybody's bouncing ideas off each other. But that, of course, has some disadvantages sometimes, right? There can be a social hierarchy in the group, and some people aren't comfortable speaking in front of others, and there's a power dynamic sometimes, right? And so they did a whole bunch of experiments where they compared brainstorming sessions that were either completely alone, completely in groups, or rotated back or forth from alone and in groups. And the ones who rotated back and forth, those group of participants, they came up with the most new ideas. They were the most creative. Again, suggesting that if we want to spark creativity, yes, it's good to be alone, but it's also good to have some input from others, but we need both. That's the big theme here, right? Being alone is actually good for your relationships. That's another, maybe a paradox, right? Spending some time by your alone can actually help you with your relationships. That idea has been around for a while. Right? Spend a little time getting to know yourself. It helps you to get to know others. Right? A little self-exploration will help your other exploration. But there's a couple of studies now that suggest that on days when we spend a little bit more time alone than we usually do, we report having more positive and enjoyable relationships and interactions with others on those same days and the next day. Okay? So there's a carryover effect. It pays forward. Spend a little time alone, get yourself together, and it'll actually make you feel happier and more positive about the interactions that you have with relationships with others. So that's pretty cool. Right? There's a way to resolve that kind of paradox. Again, you're an extrovert, you love being around people, take a little bit of time for yourself, and you'll enjoy it even more. Okay? And then maybe most importantly, there's now a series of studies that suggest, some with adults, some with older adults, that suggest that people whose social interaction patterns are characterized by this rotation, right? Sometime by myself, sometime with others, then I take some time for myself, then I take time with others. That maximizes your well-being, even more so than the people that are always with others. Okay, so even extroverts can get tired of being around other people sometimes. Okay, we all need a break. Maybe it's different, as we'll see, and that's okay, but everybody benefits from this kind of back and forth. Okay, and these are all studies out in the last 2 or 3 years, so I think we're just scratching the surface in terms of demonstrating the potential of how this kinds of back and forth, this rotation, right, this balance between solitude and time with others is going to be most helpful for us. Now, all of the complaints I've given you so far have been about people not spending time alone or feeling like they don't want to spend time alone and there's an excuse for not doing it. But of course, and some of you I'm sure in this room, you're thinking, well, that's not me. I want more time alone. I can't get enough of it. Okay? So what if you feel like you need more time alone? Right? This was certainly a common experience over the pandemic. Right? If you were a working parent, working from home, and your kids were working from home, you never get a moment to yourself. One of my colleagues who's a clinical psychologist in Ottawa was telling me stories during the pandemic about some of their clients who would go sit in the car in the driveway for their session because it was the only place where they could be by themselves, even for a few minutes during the lockdown. I mean, crazy, right? So we talked before about some of the bad things that can happen if we don't meet our need to belong. That's loneliness. Okay? But what happens if we don't meet our need for solitude? That's something that my colleagues and I started looking at a few years ago. Right before the pandemic started, we started getting into this particular idea. And we postulated that there would be negative feelings that would also arise, right, from not spending enough time alone, from being dissatisfied with our solitary lives, from the discrepancy between how much time we would like to be spending alone and the quality of that time and how much we're actually getting. Right? So this is kind of the mirror image of loneliness in a lot of ways. It's the other side of that coin. And when we started investigating this phenomenon, we were surprised that no one had really looked at it before. It didn't even have a name. So we named it, we called it aloneliness. Okay, again, to sort of get that opposite, right? And those are the bad feelings that you feel when you're not getting enough time alone. Okay? And I think just raising awareness, just giving this a name and raising awareness about it is really important for people who might be feeling these kinds of feelings and not even, they have to know that this is a real thing. Right? And that it turns out there are implications, right? Over a series of studies, we found that feeling alonely, not feeling like you're not spending enough time alone, okay, is associated with a lot of the same kinds of things as loneliness. It puts you in a bad mood, makes you feel stressed. It's even associated with symptoms of depression. Okay? Just last year, a researcher in Europe who had asked me for this measure, who studies romantic relationships, they found that if someone in a romantic partnership in a marriage or dating relationship was feeling like they weren't getting enough time alone, it made them angry and have aggressive tendencies towards their partner, right? So they're blaming their partner for not being able to spend time alone. So here's another example about how solitude can help your relationships, right? And so we really think it's important that people understand that, first of all, that this is a thing and that it has a name now and that it's something that we should be drawing attention to. And when we get back to our little user's guide, it's okay to ask for time alone. We should really be normalizing this. Right? This should be something that should be absolutely acceptable. If your friends want you to go out on a Friday night with them, you shouldn't have to come up with an excuse not to go out. It should be perfectly socially acceptable, perfectly normal to say, not tonight, I want to spend a little bit of me time. That's okay. It should be okay to say to your partner, or your spouse, right, a family member, I love you, but I'm going to go for a walk by myself now. Right? That doesn't mean there's a problem with our relationship. That doesn't mean that there's issues. It doesn't mean that I have, a psychopathology. It's just, this is how I'm wired. And that should be okay. And that is a hugely important message, I think, that we have to try to get out there. As an overall metaphor for the kind of main takeaway message that I would like you to leave here, I think that solitude and social interactions are governed by what we would call the Goldilocks hypothesis, right? Just like the story, right? So Goldilocks walks into the three bears' bedroom, and this bed is too small, and this bed is too big, but that middle one is just right? That's how we should be thinking about solitude. Right? So for you, that one is too much. And for you, that one is too little. But everybody has their own just right amount of solitude that is going to optimize well-being and just the right amount of time with others. Right? And that we all have to kind of find our balance. Right? And that if someone is saying to you, you need to spend 4 hours a day interacting with other people and 1 hour a day in solitude, well, it's great that that works for them, but it doesn't mean it works for you. Okay? So everybody has to come up with their own, and a little experimentation, do the diary stuff that I talked about, spend a little bit more time alone, spend a little bit more time with others, do a little bit of real life experimentation with this stuff to see what works for you. And when you can find that Goldilocks, special just right zone for yourself, that's when you're going to feel the best. That's going to be the best for your mood. That's going to be the best for your creativity, for yourself, and for your well-being. Okay? And that we should be raising awareness with the idea that we can all find the right balance and that that all should be okay for everybody. Okay, so before I finish off, I alternate between solitude and interacting with others when I do my research, and I do want to take a moment to acknowledge some of my collaborators. These are my international collaborators from Norway and China and Italy and the UK and the US and Indonesia, just a handful of some of the people that I've had the great fortune of working with over the last number of years. And of course, my incredible, wonderful, gifted, smart, current and former graduate students who are the lifeblood of my lab and keep me young and bring all the new ideas to what we're doing. And I really need to give them their dues for making my lab a place where you can have time for solitude, but also have time for interacting with others. And with that, I think I will say thank you very much. This is some contact information for me, so I'm going to cede the stage. Thank you.